Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my pleasure to welcome back Rabbi Moshe Taragin, a very good friend, but more importantly, one of the most exceptional and extraordinary mechanchim in our Jewish community today. Rav Taragin has been a Ram for more than 2 decades at Yeshivat Har Etzion. He is smicha from REITS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University, a BA in Computer Science, an MA in English Literature. He has taught all over the world, and most importantly, he has continued to make us think, not only through his teachings, but also through his writings as well. And so, Rabbi Taragin, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure and it's an honor to join you, and hopefully one day.
Well, we will see you. We will be seeing. Yes, we will be seeing you in person this year at KNS also. So Baruch Hashem, we're looking forward to continuing. But let me start out with a conversation which has been on the minds of a lot of American Jewry about what's going on in Israel today, and especially from your perspective atop the mountain at Har Etzion with the protests and what seems to be a very divisive environment within Israeli society. How does it impact society? How does it impact the day-to-day?
It's obviously a question that's on everyone's mind, not just in Chicago, but in Alon Shvut, not just in New York, but in Rehovot. This is a very important point of inflection. It's obviously a lot deeper than the politics. There are 3 or 4 levels, 3 or 4 fault lines that this whole judicial reform is exposing. And I like to see it as part of the challenge of redemption. Part of the challenge of redemption is not just getting on a plane and giving up your past life and living in Israel. And part of the challenge of redemption is not just fending off hostile enemies, but in gathering people. We lived separately for thousands of years. We developed our own ethnicities. We developed our own politics. We developed our own levels of wealth. And all these things now are coming to a head. I think they were brushed aside for the first 75 years of our peoplehood, because we face such a harsh and acute existential threat that we rallied around the defense of our country, the Holocaust saga that is slowly fading, that we're here to offer a solution to the Holocaust, never again. So all these narratives that, as I would say, homogenize all these differences are less compelling now. We're an entrepreneurial society. Thank God it's a wealthy society. So as our mind is shifting from the security situation, not that we ignore it, we just suffered terrible tragedies, even in the Gush over the last 2 days. Someone was killed in Drom Har Hebron. But as our security situation stabilizes, we're now trying to finesse the split between Ashkenazi and Sephardi, the split between wealthy and non-wealthy, between people who are more nationalist in their outlook, and even if they're not religious, they want there to be a Jewish flavor to our state and a Jewish flavor to Shabbos, and people that are more universalists, and they want this to be a pure democracy. So this is just the birth pangs of trying to move our people forward.
But in that sense, how do we teach our community that this is just the birth pangs, that we need somehow to figure out a way to make things work, and that we have to be open to other ideas? How do we do that? As opposed to saying, like in America, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat and you're right and you're wrong. It's black and white. We're done.
Look, as your question implies, this is not an Israeli issue. We live in a very polarized world. Social media has created echo chambers where we don't listen to other people. We're not exposing ourselves to other views. As you said, people are looking, instead of building identity from within, based on their character, based on their traits, based on their family, based on deeply held values, they're looking for artificial substitutes for character. And I abhor the notion that anyone would call themselves a Republican or a Democrat or left or right. You're a person, I'm a person with values and dignity and free will and conscience, and you may vote for a particular party or not, but as you said, but I don't sense that question is vastly different than the question you're facing in America. How do you educate to respect people? There's actually a fascinating story where in the early 70s, Shimon Peres came to visit the yeshiva. And he asked Rav Lichtenstein, what are the politics of your yeshiva? And Rav Aaron said 3 things: learn to respect other people, learn to argue with respect, and learn that life is complicated. And Peres was waiting for, are you right or are you left? Are you this politics or that politics? And Rav Aaron was saying, I could care less about the politics of my students. I want to train them to be respectful, dignified, thinking, complex people that can process a world which isn't black and white. But
Are we still able to do that? Are we still able to educate people to understand nuance, to understand that life is complex and not just the black and white?
I mean, answer your own question. What do you think?
I
And
think
how,
it's
obviously,
much
how
more.
do you go?
I think it's gotten much more difficult in the world we live. Just as we've seen the fall of a liberal arts education, a humanities education, and now everything is driven by profession and by some level of expertise. We're training plumbers and we're training doctors. I think it's very, very hard to do so. People want naturally to have that easy black, white. It's hard to live in gray.
I think so. I think so. I think it starts at the top. I think if leaders like yourself, and not just public figures, but everyone's a leader in their family, and when the conversations take place at the table, you aren't didactic. You don't try to triumph or extinguish other opinions, and you train the people in your life that there are multiple truths and people see things differently, and those are legitimate opinions. You can disagree. I was just sharing a story this morning. I taught a Gemara in Bava Kama. We just started learning Bava Kama. And I quoted an Or Sameach. The Or Sameach was a sefer on the Rambam written by Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, one of the great luminaries of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. He wrote a sefer on the Rambam called the Meshech Chachma, the Or Sameach, Parash and Chumash called the Meshech Chachma. And evidently, he once spoke at a convention of all the leading Torah scholars, which was also attended by Reb Chaim Mibrisk, who was known to be a fanatic. And when Rabbi Meir Simcha got up to speak, Reb Chaim was so opposed to his opinions that he took his chair and he turned his back to Rabbeinu Meir Simcha, one of the great scholars of the period. He didn't want to even show his face to this great speaker. Conduct, which for you and I, obviously, would be rude, but for Reb Chaim was completely consistent with his persona. Anyway, the next day, Reb Chaim was about to leave the city where this convention took place, and he told his associates, before we leave the town, let's go say goodbye to Reb Simcha of Dvinsk, the Dvinsker Rav. So his associate said, what do you mean? You don't want to listen to a word he said. Why are you going to say goodbye to him? He said, what do you mean? He's the Gadol Hador. I just disagree with his opinion, but he's the Gadol Hador. I'm going to go show him honor as the Gadol Hador. I just didn't like his opinion. I wanted to demonstrate I didn't like his opinion. So the ability to separate between opinion and identity, both when you're discussing other people, you respect them even though you disagree, but it has to start with yourself. If you self-define to opinions in politics, it's going to be hard to disassociate in other people. If you see yourself as a person independent of whatever public opinions you adopt, it'll be easier for you to create that severance in others, I think.
Well, while we're talking, though, about stories, and just to finish this point maybe a little bit further, or move this point forward a little bit more, it's told that in the great yeshiva of Volozhin, the Netziv, who was actually very much involved in Zionist politics, forbade anyone to be involved in politics, forbade any of the Talmidim to be reading secular papers and things of that nature, even though he himself received the paper and read it on a daily basis. Given the world today, are we able to create these incubators that once were yeshivas of these higher thinking models? Or is it just that we can't find the escape? And if we would have a Rosh Yeshiva come down with the same rules as the Netziv did, no social media, no phones, no this, no that, it wouldn't be able to exist. And so we have all of these intrusions. We aren't able to create that sense of higher values. So can we?
My opinion, but it's only my own personal opinion. Look, I think in general, we have a tendency to vilify or criminalize technology because technology jumps us, it surprises us, it changes our world radically. And before we know it, we're playing catch up and we're trying to understand the technology that's taken valuable parts of our lives. And our easiest defense is to criminalize and to vilify it. Rather than early adopting it, understanding these are just tools, and tools empower us. And if we use them productively, they can empower us exponentially as the internet and social media can. So in theory, you could just make a counter argument that if trained the right way, with the proper sensitivity and the proper orientation, we have windows to the world and to other opinions and to more knowledge than we've ever had. And in theory, if people are given the receptors that are looking for subtlety and complexity and respect, and they can translate curiosity into respect and utilize these tools to feed their curiosity, I found, at least in my own small part of the world, I think we're being more successful than people give credit. I think the boys that we're sending back, and I can only judge by the boys that I'm dealing with, are well-rounded, they're intuitive, and they're introspective and curious, in part because they have exposure to the likes that we didn't have, and we didn't have these access points.
So if you compared the boys you started teaching 25 plus years ago to the boys today, what would you think are the biggest differences?
They're less impressionable, which again is both good and bad, because the world used to, or at least the yeshiva world used to create a disconnect. It was very insular. It was very amputated from the world around them. They had less access to sports, less access to family. Now, the immersion is lost. I think I told you this last year. Whenever a boy comes back from the yeshiva, people give yeshivas in Israel way too much credit or way too much blame. We don't carry the same punch we used to, because the boys are not amputating or severing themselves from their past culture. We're part of the team. You train them for 12 years in Ida Crown. We'll take them for a year or two. And hopefully that mix will generate a young man or young woman who's dedicated to Torah, to religion. But on the other hand, I think their exposure, that they're much more sort of like educated consumers. I think you have to be more honest, because they can, I don't want to say fact check, that they're going to look at their phone and question something you're saying, but they're more knowledgeable, and therefore you have less control of their minds, which ultimately I think is a positive thing, because it less lends itself to manipulation and indoctrination. You have to be a more respectful educator. But when they sense that you're authentic and accurate, I think that your credibility spikes, because they sense that this is a person who's treating me like an adult, who's respecting my dignity, who's respecting my own knowledge base, and is still trying to move me religiously or spiritually. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think, like everything else, there are opportunities. We have to learn how to capitalize upon them.
Are they as observant as they were once upon a time?
Again, it's not a question I can answer well, because fortunately or not, in our yeshiva, we're dealing with a very distinct demographic and a very distinct statistic. The boys coming, let's say, to Yeshiva Har Etzion from Ida Crown, by and large, surpass the boys that you sent us 20 years ago, by and large. So in terms of the boys that you're preparing to retain, but I know it's not reflective of the overall. See, we have a luxury that we're just dealing with a very, very distinct sector of adolescent America. You and Ida Crown, you're dealing with a much broader spread, so you're seeing that better. I mean, what would you say?
But you see it. You see the other yeshiva boys. The boys are not as insular as they once were, and so I would assume the same thing is true of the yeshivas. That you'll see the boys from other yeshivas. Not asking you to name any other yeshivas, but you'll see the range of the people who come. Are they? You mentioned that they're not as receptive in some ways because they're willing to check and willing to question, but can be an advantage. They're not as isolated. They don't have to rely on the aerogram or paying in advance to make a phone call. But they're on WhatsApp, whatever they want to be on WhatsApp. But are the boys and the girls coming from the United States, how have they changed? You're getting that slice, but there's a bigger pie. Have you seen anything bigger on that?
Wealth has increased, and with wealth comes entitlement. With entitlement comes a sense of deservedness and less willingness to change. People that are searching have less, are searching more, and when you're searching more, you'll find newer truths that you weren't exposed to in high school. I think entitlement creates confidence and stagnance, and you're very comfortable in your world. Obviously, the issue we're picking up, especially post-COVID, which you're picking up also, is tremendous levels of stress, anxiety, underconfidence, obviously sadness bordering upon depression. Any young man or woman who speaks with me about planning a career in education, I say the best thing you could do for yourself is to get a secondary degree in psychology, because every single educator will have to be professional. I'm not professionally trained, so I'm astute, hopefully, and I'm a good listener, and I've been around the block a few times as you had, but the second I sense it's getting out of my range, it's irresponsible for me to guide that young man or woman through a more labyrinthine process. And I think that every teacher from here on in has to have even a modicum, a couple courses in college, maybe a master's, maybe not necessarily a doctorate, but they absolutely have to know the human psyche, because many of the children are coming broken, even the successful ones, even the ones who are successful academically, internally, there's a lot of stress.
There was an issue, the latest issue of Rabbi Angel's Conversations, questions the issue of modern Orthodoxy, its future, its potential. When you began your career as an educator, there were these extraordinary, towering figures of the modern Orthodox world. The Rav was still capable of giving shir. The Rav Lichtenstein was rising. Rav Amital. Do we still have those kinds of figures? Are there people that we can turn to say our future in the centrist, modern, Dati Tzioni world is bright and the future is great and look at what we're producing? Or are we in a Tkufat Beinayim, an interim period, and hopefully there'll be great ones coming in the future?
Like the easy answer is obviously no. I don't think that we're going to uncover Rav Lichtenstein under a stone somewhere. I don't know that Rav Amital is going to reemerge. He was very much a product of the 20th century and all these shifts of Jewish history that he encountered, that he lived through. But I don't think that's a question that you or I can answer, especially you, because to a degree, I think people look to you differently. You're not Rav Amital, you're not Rav Lichtenstein, but you carry your own impressive set of traits and leadership. And the next generation will look to the leaders of our generation who may not see themselves. And that's always true of any generation. I don't think, let's say, the Noda B'Yehuda saw himself as a Vilna Gaon, but people saw him as the Noda B'Yehuda. And he was an incredibly impressive person, a little bit different than the Vilna Gaon. He had different traits and it was a different era. You know, there's we just read in Parsha Shoftim, last week's Parsha, that you should come to the Navi Asher Yiyah B'Makom Ahu, in that place, right? So what does Chazal say? Chazal say, Yiftach B'dara Kishmuel B'dara. Yiftach, even though he's inferior to Shmuel, should be seen as Shmuel. So why did Chazal, when they articulated this aphorism that a Yiftach, an inferior, crass, maybe Navi, should be heralded like Shmuel, why did they pick Yiftach? There are plenty of lower grade Nevi'im and Shoftim to choose from. So there's an old Hasidic art from Simcha Bunim that it means Yiftach means because that person opens up something in their generation that other generations couldn't open up. So it's Yiftach because he'll open something up for people, even though he won't carry the same talent and the same accomplishments as Shmuel. In his generation, he has the keys and he has the wisdom to open up venues and religious meaning for people that maybe even those of previous generations who superseded him in terms of raw talent or raw erudition or raw piety didn't have the skills and didn't have the cultural sensors to open. So I think people like ourselves get caught in this. The generations are declining, and because we'll never see people the way we saw our great leaders. But I think younger generations will see its leaders in ways that are commensurate, even though the personalities may not be equivalent.
And going back to the Israel experience, one of the things I've worked very hard on is to try to make sure that students, after they finish their high school experience, move on to Israel for at least a year, maybe more. And the numbers making Aliyah is growing for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that the college tuition in the United States is so high, and in Israel it's so very reasonable. But do you feel today that the year in Israel is as critical as it was 20 years ago when you were able to create that bubble? Or are we doing a lot of America in Israel?
I think it's at least as important. Why would it be more important? I think just the American culture has become very aggressive, very polarized, as you said before, very loud, very angry. Not that Israeli culture is less angry, but when young men and women come for a year, they're walking out of the culture a little bit, even though it's not as insular, but in a way that you can't replicate or recreate in America. I think that you can tell me, but as American support for the state of Israel starts to wane in certain sectors, and as the politics start to shift in America, which they inevitably will at some point, some of this can bleed into the Orthodox. Support for Israel is still strong in the Orthodox world, but Orthodox Jews don't live in a bubble. And if those who are less inclined to support the state of Israel because they disagree with its policies tend to become more vocal and garner more political clout, that could start to nibble away at not just the political support within Orthodox circles, but also identification. The first thing to go is identification. Even people who strongly support Israel, they may not travel as much, they may not vacation as much. So I think for Israeli identification, to disconnect from the culture, and as part of that disconnect from the culture, to immerse in a study of the Word of Hashem, I don't think it's less imperative. I would tend to think it's more. And of course, I'm a little prejudiced, so I'm not the right person to right, ask that question up.
Now, we've talked about before that you came from not the typical modern Orthodox background. In fact, your education up until high school was in a Haredi environment. My assumption is that your Yiddish is almost as good as Rav Lichtenstein's was, but maybe not Litvish like his was. But if are there possibilities of bringing people from right and left into center today, or have we built those walls?
I think that at some point all these ideologies will fade. People sometimes ask a similar question: what do I make of the Haredi ideology? And I tell them, I think Haredism is 75 years old. Haredism is not 500 years old. It's a response to a certain set of cultural trigger points and circumstances that emerged in the 19th century, in the 20th century, between Enlightenment and emancipation and the terrible, terrible trauma of millions of Jews walking out of Orthodoxy, and the institutionalization of Zionism, which quite frankly, had it happened in the 16th century, everyone would be a Zionist, but it came masked as a secular nationalist movement, and the trauma of the Holocaust. And different camps created different sets of lenses through which to view all these events. And Haredism is one lens through which to view it. It's a legitimate and a very powerful and successful lens. And modern Orthodoxy is another lens through which to process all these events. And National Zionism in Israel, religious Zionism is another lens. But these are very, very temporal, contextual, historically fleeting responses to those pressure points that we experienced over the last 200 years. I'm totally, totally confident that in 150 years, those words will be relics. And people will focus on what unites us. And like it was in the shtetl, if you want a reflection of what we'll be in 200 years and what we were 200 years ago, look at the Sephardic world. In the Sephardic world, they don't have cantonization. They don't have different groups. They don't have different ideologies. Everyone comes to shul. This one does more mitzvahs. This one does less mitzvahs. This one walks to shul. This one drives to shul. This one, they don't. That's an Ashkenazi mishigas. So we have to divide into camps. It has its strengths and it has its weaknesses, but these have an expiry date on them, and they're not going to last another 100. But not in our lifetime. I think in our lifetime, the change, the adjustments will be minimal. But these walls right now provide comfort and provide enclosure for people trying to process a very confusing history of the last 150 years or so.
And that confusing history is changing, obviously. The today is very different than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Are there things that you were already beginning to see change in that direction of either breaking down the walls or creating new walls?
Look, I think you could probably comment on that, because in America, I think the walls aren't as high because you're not forced to define yourself. In America, you can live, let's say, in Skokie or in West Rogers Park and hop in on the Tells-based Medrash and go to the, what do they call it, where everyone learns at night, that tech center where everyone goes and learns, and you could daven in Kins and you go to Eichenstein's, and you're not forced to define yourself. In Israel, you shouldn't be forced to define yourself, but every 4 years you vote. And generally you vote for parties whose ideology you generally agree with. But more importantly than that is young men in particular, but even young women at the age of 17, 18, you have to decide whether you're going to the army or not. You have to decide whether you're going to college or not. And these walls are very binary. These decisions are very binary, and they affect women as well, because women are going to be marrying men based on these decisions. And I think that's where a lot of Americans get caught. A lot of Americans move to Israel and are frustrated by that need to define, because they're more accustomed to living in the areas of gray and hovering from one position to another. And a lot of Americans say, you know what, I'll make a decision. And that decision is I'll squarely align myself with national religious or align myself with Haredi. A lot of Americans are involved in a very fascinating anthropological experiment. They're perpetuating these cultural bubbles for 2 or 3 generations. At some point, someone's going to pay the price. At some point, someone's got to enter and assimilate within mainstream Israeli society, and they're going to shoulder the burden of the shift that the parents didn't take. I'm not blaming parents. I understand it, but you're just pushing the debt down the line. At some point,
they're creating Anglo communities that are not defining.
Right, Anglo bubbles, Anglo enclaves. So if you come when you retire, you don't really have to change who you are. You can live amongst the Anglos in Netanya or in Yerushalayim or in Beit Shemesh. But if you come and you've got 3, 4 kids, so you're creating these little enclaves in Ramat Beit Shemesh or little enclaves in Renana, little enclaves, and that gives you the freedom to still be, as they would say, not Haredi and not Dati Lomi, but the country isn't going to be able to support that added bubble. At some point, someone has to make the shift.
But doesn't the bubble get burst when their children reach the 17, 18 and have to make the decision which way to go?
Not really, because they're marrying themselves. The kids are marrying themselves or people like them, and they're creating institutions. So let's say, for example, a kid who's unsure. So he'll go to one of these Hesder yeshivas that's a little bit closer to the Haredi world, and that will serve his needs, and he'll marry, and you have a shul. So you can create enough resources and infrastructure to perpetuate it for another generation or two. But as the numbers grow, and of course, it's not just infrastructure and resources. Also, kids are looking around them. They're going to pick up Israeli music or Haredi music. They're going to be drawn to larger cultural apparatuses than whatever they can self-provide within these small little enclaves.
So if someone was making Aliyah and was asking where they should live, and big picture, would you recommend a more integrated Israeli community for an American?
There's no rule of thumb. Look, the elephant in the room or in the zoo is a larger question. Many immigrants who move to Israel are struggling to keep the next generation religious. And it's no secret. And it crosses all cities, communities. I live in Alon Shvut, and Alon Shvut doesn't have a record any better than Ranan or any better than Beit Shemesh. And the Rabbanim in Yeshiva have that phenomena occurring in their family. So there's no rhyme or reason, and there's no way to there's no logical way to face it or to solve it. And some rabbis in America, I'm sure you know better than me, have begun to discourage Aliyah under these terms. They've told their congregants or their students, don't make Aliyah because you risk the orthodoxy of your children. I can understand that. I disagree with that, but I can understand that. But people who are moving to Israel under that fear and under that anxiety may find these limited cultural enclaves more comforting and more confidence building, and it may be easier for them to work their way through this maze by not integrating. A lot depends on how much time they spent in Israel until now. Did they attend an Israeli yeshiva? Did they attend an American? If, let's say, someone doesn't have good Hebrew, doesn't understand Israeli culture, attended, let's say, I don't know, one of the great American programs, Tarash Raga, 20 years ago, which has less of an encounter with the broader Israeli society. It's not in any way a knock on Tarash Raga. So for them, it may just be easier to live in Grus, which is the YU environment affiliated with YU, to move to Ramat Beit Shemesh, to operate within the system, to work in America, and to see Aliyah as a multi-generational project. I'm not going to leap into the pool right now. I'm going to stick my pinky and my toes into the pool. Then my child will stick his ankle, and maybe my grandchild, great-grandchild will jump in full headlong. So you just have to know yourself.
It's complicated, but it's also, unfortunately, almost the end of our time together, Rabbi, and I appreciate that time. So let me end on a positive note, if you would. We're coming up.
And positive until now. It's all positive.
I know, but it's a little scary, that last piece. We're coming up to Rosh Hashanah. What is it this year that you're going to be talking about with your Talmidim during Elul and Rosh Hashanah that may be different than previous years?
I don't have an answer to that question, only because I feel the struggle of social strife and civil strife in Israel so deeply. I don't want that to smother other avenues that I should be thinking about, but I haven't yet had the mind space to climb out from under that shadow. It's casting such a heavy shadow. And now, unfortunately, again, I think Americans, because it's the summer, because our minds are still elsewhere, we're going through a very, very difficult wave of terror. And that's something that I want to be able to struggle with and wrestle with and daven on behalf of in the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur tonality rather than the normal tonality. But the easy answer is achdos and unity, but there's got to be more, and I'm not yet at the place that I can answer that question. I know there's something more, but I know that there's such a smokescreen because it's created literally so many protests and smoke that I'm not able to see what it is yet. So I have to take a pass on that question.
Well, you'll take the pass, but hopefully by the time you make it into Chicago in January for Atkins, we'll be able to have some more answers for it, and hopefully it'll all be resolved as well. On that note, Rabbi, our time is up. I thank you so much for your efforts. I
My
apologize
pleasure.
for those who were having some technical difficulty at the beginning. We will resolve it by next week, when we also have the opportunity to hear from Rav David Stav, who's also I'm sure, add some presentation and some perspective to this. Rabbi Taragin, thank you so very much for everything you do, and especially for today.
Thank you for being a role model to me and for so many other people. I treasure our relationship, and I treasure the time we get to spend together.
So do I. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.